Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. In today's workplace experience, perhaps more so than at any other point in history, we have potentially millions of people working remotely, if not in a full-time capacity, then at least in a hybrid type of setup where they may be on-site at the office or at their workplace for some part of the week and working remotely, whether that's from home or from anywhere else for another part of their day or their week. With that, of course, come a variety of challenges, both for the employer and the employee. And in today's episode, we'll talk about the challenges of managing virtual teams. And that includes both fully virtual teams as well as hybrid teams. Both present some challenges that may not have been experienced in the past when managing was more of a face-to-face experience for both the manager and the employee. One of the most common and basic challenges of managing virtual teams or remote teams may be the sheer fact that this is a new experience, both for the manager and for the employees. As such, it requires some adjustments, it requires some learning, and of course, it requires some getting used to. As we're experiencing more remote work throughout a variety of setups and industries throughout the world, one of the biggest things that keeps popping up as a potential issue is lack of communications. That's not a surprise because even before remote work became as big as it is today, lack of communications was often a source of problems for many employees and employers. It's not difficult to understand then that if we add distance or a lack of presence, if you will, a lack of communication can become an even bigger issue. It leaves us to wonder why these communication gaps. Well, to begin with, it may very simply be that communication wasn't all that great to begin with, and when remote work got added into the mix, it became that much more noticeable, that much more obvious that there are gaps or issues in terms of proper effective communications. The other part of it, of course, is the absence, the lack of face-to-face interactions between employee and employer, between the manager and the team members. The other thing that has also come into play and become more noticeable or maybe more prevalent in many cases is that when we are not working together in a shared space, a shared physical space, sometimes team cohesion takes a hit. Add to that a lack of communication or gaps in communications, and we have even bigger issues potentially brewing in the workplace experience. What is a manager to do if you are in a management role or a leadership role? It's likely that you have at least some employees who work either remotely on a full-time basis or in a hybrid type of setting where maybe they're on site some of the time and work remotely for the rest of the time. If this is a new experience to you, it's something that you absolutely have to address head on. You may be required to Make peace with a new way of doing things, roll up your sleeves, learn some new skills, and take a different approach, a new approach to managing your team. And as an employee, you are also subject to challenges and will have to make adjustments and get used to things, perhaps learn new technologies, new ways of communicating, new ways of being part of a team. As an employee, you too have a responsibility to be a willing participant and to be all in terms of the virtual or remote experience. It takes two sides for remote management to be effective. Not only do you need a good manager, a good leader, but you also need employees who are willing to play along and participate fully. One of the first suggestions that I will make for managers, but also for employees, is to make sure that you have regular check-ins. This is very much the manager's responsibility. While you don't want to overwhelm people or interfere with their work, you do want to stay connected. Check-ins can be via phone, via email, via text, or chat, whatever you use to communicate. Popular platforms for video conferencing are always a good option and are used by most organizations. But remember that just because regular check-ins are a good idea, there's no need to be intrusive. Just as you wouldn't pop into somebody's office or cubicle too many times throughout the day, constantly interrupting them, you don't want to do the same thing in a virtual setting. You want to make sure that your check-ins are appropriate, but not intrusive or distracting. Check-ins, of course, can be for the team as a whole, but also for one-on-one interaction between manager and employee. Keep in mind that both are equally valuable and equally important to the experience of managing remote teams effectively. And of course, this isn't limited solely to managers. As an employee, if you need to have a conversation or get in touch with your manager, don't wait until they reach out to you. Reach out to them as you need to. And while realistically, maybe these communications, these check-ins wouldn't be exactly as they would be done in person if everybody was on site at the same location, they should not be so sparse or so different that we're now out of touch with one another, that we're now experiencing communication gaps. Trust yourself in your judgment. We're all adults with jobs, which means we should be able to have some level of discernment and good decision making. Don't put off talking to someone about an important issue or an important topic just because you're not in the same space. At the same time, don't overdo it with constantly interrupting someone just to make sure that you're still in touch because you're not within sight of one another, not within the same space. The other important thing to consider when we think of successful management of remote teams are clear expectations and clear goals. Sometimes working remotely, working in a different space, working from home can add a little confusion or ambiguity in terms of tasks and responsibilities. This is where managers really need to step up to make sure that everybody understands what is required of them, what their goals are, what the expectations are, and what they should be accomplishing on a daily basis. If you were able to get away with less clarity or some ambiguity when everybody was on site, now is not the time to follow that same recipe. Now is the time to really become clear in terms of goals and expectations. Of course, employees should not wait for managers to clear things up, but rather, if you don't know what is expected of you, if you don't know what the goals are, if you don't know what you should be working on, reach out to your manager. Make sure everybody's on the same page. You're much better off asking questions than wondering and getting nothing done instead. Or worse yet, getting the wrong things done. We have some amazing technology available to us in today's day and age, and this is especially true when we look at the workplace. So why not utilize technology to our benefit, to our advantage? Leverage it in such a way that it helps us to stay connected, that it helps us to have those clear and effective communications, to stay connected and cohesive as a team. A word of caution about technology. Two things, actually. One, it can be intrusive. So as you work within the remote space, let's make sure that technology is serving us and not interrupting us. The other part of that is making sure that technology is used for work and productivity and not for spying or checking up on employees. Nothing can ruin that trust, that relationship quicker than evidence of being spied on when working remotely. It may seem as a good idea during some fleeting moment, but the reality is that it can be tremendously harmful and detrimental to everyone's experience. So remember, technology in all its helpfulness and potential can be a glorious tool for everybody to experience, but it can also be detrimental if misused. Which brings me to the next point of building trust. While having trust on a team has always been important, when we work remotely, when we manage others remotely, that trust factor becomes that much more critical to everyone's experience. Employees who feel like they are trusted and respected and given the autonomy to do their jobs with the proper information and support, of course, will always produce and perform better than those employees who feel like they are not trusted, who feel like they're being watched with every move that they make. That sounds like a no-brainer, but you might be surprised how many companies, how many managers seem to forget that. As a manager, work on building that culture of trust, that environment of trust. One way to make sure that you have a cohesive team is making sure everyone is engaged. Keep those communications going, but make sure that you're not overdoing it, that you're not interrupting people and creating a disruptive environment where meetings are unnecessary and yet still happen. Of course, individual employees have just as much responsibility in this. While the employer, while the manager can do all the right things to create an environment of trust, to promote engagement, to promote the kind of culture, create that kind of culture that would embrace and enhance remote work, individual employees have to play a good part, have to play their role in it. They cannot misuse that trust and expect the environment to remain intact, which means that even in a conversation about how to effectively manage remote teams, the responsibilities and the opportunities are not solely those of managers or those in leadership positions, but every single individual employee as well. And if you think about building an environment with a sense of belonging, building a team that is cohesive, that does embody that sense of belonging, this is not something that can be accomplished solely by a manager or solely by a leader. There has to be full-out participation by the individual team members. So again, this is everybody's responsibility. If we want to have the privilege and the ability to work remotely, the convenience to work remotely, we all have to contribute to the kind of experience that will provide a win-win for everyone involved. That means managers, leaders, and individual employees as well. It's a shared experience, so it's also a shared responsibility. What's the bottom line when we think about managing remote teams? Well, first, we have to be flexible and adaptable. We have to be able to learn new ways of doing things, but we also have to have a certain sense of empathy for one another and for ourselves if we're looking at it from a manager's point of view or a leader's position. And while a manager may get the credit or maybe take the credit for how well or poorly they're doing in terms of managing remote teams, in fact, this is something that takes everybody's effort and produces the kind of end result that hopefully everyone is looking for. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Having to manage remote teams is part of our everyday reality. If you are in management or leadership positions, you know that at some point you may encounter remote employees or maybe hybrid employees who spend part of their time working remotely. As with anything else that is new, a certain learning curve is part of the reality. The experience will likely require some learning and some adjusting, but not only on the manager's part, but also on the part of the individual employee. Lack of communication and lack of cohesion among teams are some of the most common complaints when it comes to remote work. This is why employers and employees have to focus on boosting those communications without overwhelming people with too much chatter and interruptions. Clear expectations and straightforward goals are a must when it comes to managing employees, especially when they work remotely. And of course, leveraging technology to our benefit is a tremendous opportunity. And when it comes to technology, remember to use it for good and not to spy on employees, destroying trust among the workforce. Creating the kind of environment that promotes trust and engagement is everybody's responsibility. Whether or not managing new teams is new for you as a manager or as a leader, as we move forward, as the workplace experience evolves, as technology evolves, there's always room for learning and improvement. And for the individual employees, anyone who is not in a management or leadership position, your role is just as important. So remember that while your manager may have the majority of the responsibility of figuring out how to manage remote teams, you have to be a good player in order for the environment and the experience to be a good one for everyone involved. As this week unfolds, I encourage you to consider what remote work is like in your life. If you're a manager or a leader, how are you doing with managing your remote teams? Whether you're a pro or a novice, I bet that there's room for learning and improvement. After all, things continue to change, which requires us to continue to learn and adapt. And if you are not in management, what role do you play and how do you contribute to the remote management experience? If you want the kind of environment that benefits you, remember that you have a responsibility to contribute to getting what you want regardless of your position within the organization. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of the podcast. While there, check out some of the other videos which focus on a comprehensive approach to stress management. So I invite you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.